The fluorescent lights in the Boise State University registrar office hummed a low, steady frequency. I sat in a vinyl chair and kept my hands folded in my lap. To my left sat my mother, Brenda. Her posture was flawless. Her shoulders squared beneath a cashmere cardigan designed to broadcast maternal concern. To my right sat my father, Richard, tapping a gold pen against his knee. Beside him, a lawyer unclasped a leather briefcase and slid a stack of conservatorship forms onto the desk. "We only want to help manage this, sweetheart," my mother said. She reached over, attempting to cover my hand with hers. I shifted my wrist a fraction of an inch and let her palm hit the empty vinyl armrest. The lawyer leaned forward and offered a tight professional smile to the university registrar. "As you can see," he said, "Mr. and Mrs. Vaughn are stepping in to administer Phaedra's accounts. The doctoral fellowship from the CDC is substantial. Given her recent academic exhaustion, we need to ensure the grant is handled responsibly through a family-managed conservatorship. We are simply streamlining her care." The registrar, a woman named Helen, adjusted her glasses. She stared at the forms and then at the glowing screen of her terminal. She typed a sequence of keystrokes. She hit the enter key one more time as if doubting the system output. "I understand the petition," Helen said. Her voice dropped mid-sentence. She looked past the lawyer and met my gaze. "However, I cannot route the deposit to this proposed account." My father stopped tapping his pen. "Is there a paperwork issue? We brought the notarized affidavits. Her mother and I have full legal standing." "It is not a paperwork issue," Mr. Vaughn, Helen replied. She turned the monitor slightly so the screen faced the room. "These funds were placed in an irrevocable trust back in March." My mother's hand froze on the armrest. The lawyer stopped moving. No one breathed. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, like the exact moment a pathogen breaches a cell wall. They thought they had cornered me. They had no idea I had quarantined their access months ago. "My name is Phaedra Vaughn. I am 24 years old, and I am an epidemiologist. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories, where we track the quiet infections families try to hide and the women who finally cut them out. Before I tell you how I engineered that trap, tell me in the comments how old you are and where you are listening from right now. I read every single one. Now let me take you back 6 months to the day I realized my family was the outbreak. I study how diseases spread. I spend my days in sterile environments tracking microscopic threats, mapping how a virus mutates, evades defenses, and eventually consumes its host. You learn early that a threat rarely announces itself with a blaring siren. It looks for a compromised immune system. It searches for a vulnerability, a tiny fracture in the foundation, and it quietly takes root. For 24 years, I was that compromised host. I was the quiet, reliable daughter raised in northern Idaho, trained to fix every crisis my parents manufactured. I treated their symptoms. I put out their fires. I assumed my utility was a substitute for affection. But viruses do not love the environments they feed on. They exploit them until nothing remains. The first symptom of an outbreak is always something easily dismissed as a common cold. For me, the first symptom was a piece of mail. It was a Sunday in late September. I had driven up to my parents' house for the weekend. I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water and saw it sitting on the granite counter. A thick manila envelope bearing the official seal of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, my preliminary award letter for the doctoral fellowship. The flap was torn open, a jagged, uneven tear straight through my name. My mother walked into the kitchen holding a basket of laundry. She saw me looking at the envelope. "Oh, honey," she said, brushing a piece of lint from her sleeve. "I opened that by mistake while I was sorting the bills. I thought it was another bank statement." I did not raise my voice. I did not ask how she confused a federal government seal with a local bank logo. I just watched her, and then I watched my father step into the kitchen, his eyes darting immediately to the letter. I saw the calculation in his face. He had seen the bolded numbers on the second page, $150,000. I quietly folded the letter, slid it into my bag, and drove back to my apartment. I told myself it was just a boundary issue. But that night, I logged into my old undergraduate bank account, the one my parents knew about. The system flagged 3 failed login attempts from an unrecognized device. The zip code matched my parents' house. The virus was actively probing my defenses. The blue light from my laptop screen cast long shadows against the walls of my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the digital security log. 3 failed login attempts. The timestamp showed they had tried to access my checking account while I was driving south on Highway 95 back to Boise. The IP address mapped perfectly to the rural broadband provider my parents used in northern Idaho. I did not slam the laptop shut. I did not call my mother and demand an explanation. Panic is a useless emotion in an outbreak. Panic clouds judgment and causes you to touch contaminated surfaces. Instead, I poured a glass of cold water and drank it slowly. I let the reality of those 3 failed logins settle into my system. My parents were not just curious about the Centers for Disease Control Fellowship. They were actively testing the perimeter of my financial life. They had seen the bold print on the award letter, and their immediate instinct was to find a back door into my accounts before the money even materialized. In epidemiology, we talk a lot about the incubation period. It is the silent window between exposure and the onset of clinical symptoms. During this phase, the host usually feels fine. They go to work, they buy groceries, they sleep soundly. Meanwhile, beneath the surface, the pathogen is multiplying. It is mapping the host's internal pathways, bypassing white blood cells, and preparing for a systemic takeover. My family dynamic had been incubating for decades. I grew up in a house where love was conditional and boundaries were treated as insults. My father owned a hardware store that constantly hovered on the edge of bankruptcy. He possessed a talent for buying expensive inventory that nobody in our small town needed, and a habit of ignoring ledger deficits until they became emergencies. My mother served as his chief enabler and public relations manager. She wore cashmere cardigans and hosted neighborhood dinners to project an image of effortless stability while secretly juggling credit cards to keep the lights on. I was their insurance policy. From the time I was old enough to do math, I was the one who balanced the checkbook. When I turned 16, I took a job at a local pharmacy and handed over half my paychecks to help cover the store overhead. They called it contributing to the family. They told me I was the reliable one, the mature one, the daughter, who never needed coddling. They framed my exploitation as a compliment. That is how toxic systems survive. They convince the host that carrying the burden is a noble purpose rather than a slow death. I remembered a specific afternoon during my sophomore year of college. I was working 3 jobs to pay my tuition because my parents had claimed they could not spare a single dollar for my education. I had managed to save a small emergency fund. My mother called me in tears, claiming a tax error was about to cost them the house. I transferred every cent I had to their account. I ate ramen noodles and plain rice for 6 months and walked 3 miles to campus in the snow because I could not afford a bus pass. When I came home for Thanksgiving that year, I walked into a brand new kitchen. Custom cabinets, gleaming granite countertops, and a stainless steel refrigerator. My mother poured wine and laughed, telling our relatives she had found a miraculous deal. She never mentioned my drained savings account. When I confronted her privately, she brushed my shoulder and said, "Family wealth stays in the family, sweetheart. We will pay you back when things settle down." They never paid me back. I stopped asking. I learned to build firewalls. I stopped sharing my financial milestones. I paid my own way, earned my own scholarships, and built a life 300 miles away in Boise. I thought distance was enough of a barrier. Looking at the failed login attempts, I realized distance means nothing to a pathogen that knows your genetic code. I placed my hands on the keyboard and went to work. I navigated to the bank security settings. I deleted my old security questions. The name of my first pet and my mother's maiden name were compromised data points. I replaced them with randomized strings of alphanumeric characters generated by a secure password manager. I updated the 2-factor authentication to require a biometric scan from my phone. Then I opened a new browser tab. I researched independent credit unions in Boise, institutions that had no branches in northern Idaho. I needed a financial vault that my parents did not even know existed. I scheduled an appointment for the following morning to move my meager savings out of the compromised bank entirely. The incubation period is a waiting game. You know the virus is in the system, but you have to wait for the fever to break before you can measure the full extent of the infection. Over the next week, my mother sent a series of carefully crafted text messages. They seemed harmless on the surface, but my training allowed me to see the viral markers hidden in the syntax. Just thinking about my brilliant girl, she texted on Wednesday. "Did they give you a timeline on that grant paperwork?" "We want to plan a celebration dinner." I replied with a vague statement about administrative delays. On Friday, she tried another angle. "Your father is so proud of you. He was looking at some new equipment for the store and mentioned how nice it must feel to have federal funding. Keep us posted on the deposit date so we can breathe easy for you. Breathe easy for you." The translation was clear. They were holding their breath, waiting for my payday. I maintained a sterile environment. I gave them no usable data. I went to the university lab every morning and spent my days analyzing viral loads under a microscope. I watched how microscopic organisms sought out vulnerable cells, attached themselves, and extracted nutrients until the cell collapsed. Every time I looked through the lens, I saw my parents standing in my kitchen staring at that torn envelope. The tension in my chest grew tighter with each passing day. I knew they would not stay quiet for long. A virus must feed. When the subtle approach fails, the pathogen mutates. It creates a sudden, overwhelming crisis to force the host to drop its defenses and surrender its resources. I spent the weekend fortifying my mind. I reviewed my budget. I finalized the transfer of my personal funds to the new credit union. I left the old checking account open with a balance of exactly $12.50. A decoy cell meant to draw their attention, while the real assets were hidden safely away. By Tuesday evening, the waiting was over. I was sitting at my small dining table reviewing a research paper on transmission vectors. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I felt a strange sense of anticipation. I knew the incubation period was ending. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the same way you can feel a drop in barometric pressure before a severe storm. My phone lit up on the table. The screen illuminated the dark wood surface. It was not a text message. It was a phone call. The caller identification displayed my father's name, Richard Vaughn. He almost never called me on a weeknight. My father communicated through my mother, preferring to let her handle the emotional labor of extracting favors. If he was calling me directly at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, it meant the prodromal phase was over. The subtle probing had failed. The virus was moving into the acute phase. I did not answer immediately. I let the phone vibrate across the table, listening to the rhythmic buzzing. I took a deep breath, controlling my heart rate. I mentally reviewed my protocols. Do not show emotion. Do not offer solutions. Collect the data and terminate the connection. I reached out and pressed the green button to accept the call. The silence on the line lasted for a fraction of a second before his voice filled the room. The crisis they had manufactured was about to begin. The phone vibrated across the dark wood of my dining table. I watched the screen glow with my father's name. I pressed the green icon and brought the device to my ear. I did not offer a cheerful greeting. I simply said hello. A heavy, drawn-out sigh answered me. It was a sound I had been conditioned to respond to since childhood, the perfectly rehearsed exhale of a man crushed by the burdens of providing for his dependents. My father, Richard, possessed a talent for auditory manipulation. He could convey financial ruin in the way he cleared his throat. "How are things up north?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "We are hanging on," he said. His voice was gravelly and slow. "Though I do not know for how much longer, Phaedra." He paused. He was waiting for me to ask the next question. He was waiting for me to step into my assigned role as the eager problem solver. I remained silent. I let the quiet stretch across the digital connection. In a healthy family, silence is comfortable. In my family, silence was a battleground. When he realized I was not going to prompt him, he continued, "We got a letter from the county assessor today. It is bad, sweetheart. We are behind on the property taxes for the store, way behind. They are talking about initiating foreclosure proceedings if we do not clear the arrears by the end of the month." I closed my eyes and pictured the family hardware store. The business occupied a prime piece of real estate on the main drag of our hometown, but the interior was a monument to poor inventory management. Aisles crammed with outdated fixtures and seasonal decor that never sold. For as long as I could remember, the store was a source of constant, low-level panic. My parents treated it like a vital organ that was constantly failing, demanding regular transfusions of cash to survive. A foreclosure notice meant total collapse. It meant losing the building and the income stream. The little girl inside me, the one trained to fix everything, felt a sharp spike of adrenaline. The familiar urge to save them rushed into my bloodstream. That urge is a deeply ingrained biological response. You see your pack in danger, and your instinct is to sacrifice your own resources to ensure their survival. But I am an epidemiologist. I train my mind to override panic with protocol. When a regional hospital calls the state health department to report a cluster of a highly contagious respiratory infection, you do not blindly dispatch containment teams and shut down the city. You ask for blood cultures. You verify the transmission vectors. You demand data. How far behind is the account, I asked. His voice grew softer, adopting a tone of wounded pride. "It is a big number, Phaedra. We need $20,000 just to stop the auction and get them off our backs. We have been trying to restructure the commercial loan, but the bank is dragging its feet. We just need a temporary bridge loan to get us through the quarter." A temporary bridge loan. The phrasing was precise. It sounded professional and manageable. It was designed to mask the reality that giving money to my parents was throwing cash into an incinerator. "I do not have $20,000 in liquid savings," I said. The trap snapped shut immediately. "Your mother mentioned you received the paperwork for that CDC grant," he said. His voice gained a fraction of speed, shedding the exhausted facade for a brief second. "That is a lot of money just sitting in an account. You could easily float us 20 grand. We will pay you back the second the holiday retail season kicks in. It would save the family business." The pathogen had revealed its target. The torn envelope on the kitchen counter had provided the coordinates, and now the infection was trying to breach the vault. I focused on my breathing. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold. Exhale for 4 counts. I visualized the pathogen attempting to bind to my cellular receptors. "The fellowship is not a lottery prize," I told him. My voice remained steady and clinical. "It is restricted federal funding intended to cover my doctoral research materials, data collection, and meager living stipends over the next 3 years. I cannot use government research grants as a venture capital fund for a retail business." The temperature of the conversation plummeted. The exhausted, heartbroken father vanished. The voice that replaced it was brittle, sharp, and dripping with contempt. "We are not asking for venture capital," he snapped. "We are asking for a lifeline. We fed you and clothed you for 18 years. We supported you when you wanted to run off and study diseases instead of getting a real job. Your mother is sick with worry and losing sleep every single night. We are about to lose everything we built, and you are quoting federal grant restrictions at me." He was trying to trigger an emotional hemorrhage. He wanted me defending my choices, apologizing for my boundaries, and ultimately transferring the funds to alleviate my own guilt. "If the store is facing imminent foreclosure, we need to look at the ledgers," I said, ignoring his escalating hostility. "Scan the notice from the county and email it to me. Send me the last 6 months of profit and loss statements. If I am going to figure out a structural solution, I need to review the raw data." "I am not submitting a homework assignment to my own daughter," he growled. "You either care about this family or you do not. I guess we know the answer now. Do not bother calling your mother. She is too upset to speak to you." The line went dead. The abrupt dial tone echoed in my quiet apartment. I set the phone face down on the table. My heart hammered against my ribs. A physical tremor ran through my hands. The biological toll of confronting a primary attachment figure is intense. The body registers the conflict as a threat to survival. But my mind remained entirely clear. The fever had not taken hold. I opened my laptop. I pulled up a search engine and navigated to the official government portal for the county where my parents lived. Idaho maintains strict public record laws, but property tax statuses are accessible to anyone with an address and a basic understanding of municipal websites. I typed in the commercial address of the hardware store. The search page loaded with a spinning icon that mirrored the churning in my stomach. The digital ledger appeared on the screen. I scrolled past the parcel identification numbers and the zoning classifications down to the financial history. I stared at the numbers. I read the columns 3 times to ensure I was not misinterpreting the data. The current year property taxes were paid. The previous year property taxes were paid. There were no outstanding balances. There were no liens. There were no foreclosure proceedings. The account balance displayed a clean, sharp 0. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing screen. The crisis was a phantom. The breathless panic over losing the family business, the guilt trip about my mother losing sleep, the demand for a $20,000 bridge loan. It was all a meticulously crafted fabrication. My parents did not need a lifeline to save the store. They had simply seen a document outlining a large sum of money and decided it belonged to them. They had invented a terminal diagnosis to justify extracting a cure from my veins. If they were willing to orchestrate an intricate lie about losing their livelihood to access my funding, they would not stop at a phone call. The realization hit me like a drop in atmospheric pressure. An unsuccessful attempt to manipulate a host does not cause a virus to retreat. It causes it to adapt. If I would not willingly hand over the money, they would search for a way to take it without my permission. I remembered the expired power of attorney document my mother had kept in her filing cabinet since my appendicitis surgery in high school. I realized they were preparing to bypass my consent entirely. The infection was spreading faster than I had calculated. I needed to move before they found another point of entry. The morning sun reflected harshly off the glass facade of the regional bank branch in downtown Boise. I walked through the double doors at exactly 9 o'clock. The interior smelled of industrial floor wax and recycled air. It was a sterile environment, but not the kind I preferred. Laboratories are sterilized to protect the researcher. Financial institutions are sterilized to protect the capital. I approached the front desk and requested a meeting with a personal banker. A young man named Marcus led me to a cubicle partitioned by frosted glass. He wore a crisp blue shirt and a lanyard holding his identification badge. He offered a polite greeting and asked how he could assist me. I handed him my driver's license and my debit card. I told him I needed to freeze my primary checking account, review recent activity, and establish a strict security protocol moving forward. Marcus swiped the card through his terminal and began typing. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard. Then the rhythmic clicking stopped. I watched his face. In my line of work, observing microexpressions is crucial. When a patient describes their symptoms, their body language often reveals the data they are trying to hide. Marcus stared at his monitor. He blinked twice. He shifted his weight in the ergonomic chair. His eyes darted from the glowing screen to my face and back again. A faint flush crept up his neck. "Is there a problem, Marcus?" I asked. My voice remained steady and low. He cleared his throat. He looked at my driver's license resting on his desk to verify my identity one more time. "Miss Vaughn," he said, choosing his words with deliberate care. "Were you aware that a family member attempted to alter your account status earlier this morning?" I kept my posture relaxed. I did not lean forward. I did not allow my breathing to accelerate. "Where did this occur?" I asked. "The system shows an interaction at our Coeur d'Alene branch right when they opened at 8 o'clock, he said. His gaze flicked to the screen again. "A woman identifying herself as your mother, Brenda Vaughn, presented a document requesting to be added as a joint owner on this account. She asked for immediate transfer privileges." The cold truth washed over me. The fake foreclosure crisis from the previous night had been a distraction. It was a primary attack designed to occupy my attention while the real infiltration happened elsewhere. "Did the teller grant her access?" I asked. Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, Miss Vaughn." The branch manager flagged the interaction. "Your mother presented a power of attorney form to bypass your physical absence. However, our legal review software caught a discrepancy. The document was 6 years old." He turned his monitor slightly toward me, displaying a scanned copy of the document my mother had handed to a bank teller 300 miles away. I recognized the thick black ink of my own signature at the bottom of the page. It was a medical power of attorney. 6 years ago, during my freshman year of college, my appendix ruptured. The pain had been blinding. I was rushed to the emergency room and prepped for surgery. My parents drove down to the hospital. While I lay in a prep bed, shivering from a high fever and loaded with intravenous pain medication, my mother handed me a clipboard. She told me it was standard hospital paperwork. She said she needed to sign it just in case I could not make decisions while under anesthesia. I trusted her. I signed the paper. The surgery went smoothly and I recovered. I forgot the clipboard had ever existed. My mother had not forgotten. She had taken that limited medical directive, filed it away in her cabinet, and waited. She kept it like a dormant viral strain preserved in a petri dish, waiting for the right moment to deploy it. When I refused to hand over $20,000 for a fabricated tax emergency, she drove to a local bank branch and tried to use a 6-year-old surgical document to seize control of my financial identity. The audacity was breathtaking. The manager denied the request because the document clearly stated it was limited to healthcare decisions during that specific hospitalization, he explained. The manager noted that your mother became highly agitated when told the document was invalid for financial transactions. She argued with the staff before eventually leaving the premises. "We placed a temporary hold on the account pending your verification." "Thank you, Marcus," I said. I felt the familiar clinical detachment settling over my nervous system. In epidemiology, we track how viruses survive. When a pathogen encounters a host with a strong immune response, it faces 2 options. It can die or it can mutate. A virus does not care about boundaries. It does not respect the word no. If the primary receptor is blocked, the pathogen alters its spike protein. It finds a secondary receptor, a backdoor, a forgotten pathway, to breach the cell wall and hijack the internal machinery. My mother, attempting to use a medical emergency from my teenage years to steal my doctoral fellowship, was a textbook viral mutation. "We are going to make that temporary hold permanent," I told the banker. "I want a complete freeze on all outward transfers from this account." Marcus nodded, his hands flying across the keyboard. "Understood. I am adding a fraud alert right now." "I also need to establish a verbal password," I continued. "If anyone calls this bank claiming to be me, claiming to be my lawyer, or claiming there is a family emergency, you are to provide zero information unless they provide the exact passphrase." He set up the security parameters. I chose a complex sequence of words related to cellular biology that my parents would never guess. We concluded the transaction. I walked out of the bank with the decoy account secured, holding exactly $12.50. The bulk of my meager savings was already sitting in a cashier check in my bag, destined for an independent credit union across town. I crossed the pavement to my car. The morning air was crisp, but I felt entirely hollow. I unlocked my sedan and slipped into the driver's seat. I closed the door, and the heavy thud sealed me inside the quiet cabin. I gripped the steering wheel. The leather felt rough against my palms. I stared out through the windshield at the passing traffic, but I did not see the other cars. I saw the jagged edge of that torn envelope. I saw the fake property tax records. I saw my own shaky signature on a medical form weaponized 6 years later. My strategy was flawed. I had treated the situation like a localized infection. I thought that by moving my money to a new bank, changing my passwords, and setting up verbal barricades, I could keep them out. I was thinking like a civilian. I needed to think like a scientist dealing with a level 4 biohazard. Moving my money was not enough. My parents viewed me as an extension of themselves. In their minds, my resources were their resources. My achievements were their assets. As long as the $150,000 grant was tied to my name, my mother would never stop trying to access it. She would forge new documents. She would impersonate me on the phone. She would harass the university financial aid office. She would mutate again and again until she found a crack in my armor. Standard boundaries fail when the antagonist does not recognize your right to exist as an independent entity. To stop a pathogen that relentless, you cannot just build a taller wall. You have to remove the target entirely. If the money belonged to me, I was vulnerable. The only way to achieve true quarantine was to ensure the money did not belong to me at all. Idaho is a state built on the sanctity of private property. The legal system here values individual autonomy and complex ownership structures above almost anything else. If I could separate my legal identity from the fellowship funds, my parents could drag me to court and find nothing but an empty shell. I let go of the steering wheel. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I opened a search engine and bypassed the standard retail banking options. I did not need a savings account. I needed a fortress. I typed a specific query into the search bar, looking for legal professionals who specialized in asset protection and irrevocable structures in the Boise area. I scrolled past the sponsored results and the flashy billboards. I needed someone clinical, someone who understood how to build a legal entity that could withstand a hostile siege. I found a name: Silas Thorne, estate planning and asset protection. I tapped the phone number and listened to the line ring. The battle had escalated beyond changing passwords. It was time to rewrite the genetic code of my financial existence. The law office of Silas Thorne occupied the second floor of a restored brick building in downtown Boise. The interior reflected the specific culture of Idaho. This is a northwestern state defined by its vast geography and a fierce cultural emphasis on individual autonomy. It is a place where property lines are sacred, where privacy is treated as a fundamental human right, and where the legal system operates with a rigid adherence to personal boundaries. It was the exact environment I needed to synthesize a cure. Silas Thorne did not offer warm smiles or platitudes. He wore a tailored gray suit and possessed the sharp, focused demeanor of a surgeon reviewing a complex chart. We sat across from each other at a heavy oak desk. I did not cry. I did not present my situation as a tragedy. I delivered the data with the same objective precision I used when presenting viral transmission models to my lab director. I outlined the manufactured hardware store crisis. I detailed the fake foreclosure notice and the demand for a bridge loan. I explained the incident at the Northern Bank branch where my mother attempted to weaponize a 6-year-old medical directive to hijack my financial identity. I handed him the printed security logs showing the failed login attempts originating from their broadband internet address. Silas reviewed the documents. He traced the timeline with a silver pen. He did not ask how I felt about my parents betraying me. He treated the emotional damage as irrelevant and focused entirely on the mechanics of the incoming capital. They are targeting the federal fellowship, I explained. The Centers for Disease Control is dispersing $150,000 to cover my doctoral research and living stipends over the next 3 years. If those funds land in an account bearing my name, my parents will not stop attacking the perimeter until they breach it. I cannot spend my academic career fighting off fraudulent withdrawal attempts. I need a mechanism that removes me as the target. Silas set his pen down on the leather blotter. You need a financial quarantine, he said. The legal term is an irrevocable trust. Silas leaned back in his chair and explained the architecture of the defense. In a standard checking account, you are the owner. You possess legal control over the assets, which means you can be coerced, manipulated, or sued for them. Your parents understand that as long as you hold the keys, they can pressure you into handing them over. An irrevocable trust alters the fundamental genetic code of ownership. We draft a legal entity to hold the fellowship funds. We appoint an independent corporate trustee to manage the account. You are named the sole beneficiary, restricted to accessing the capital strictly for educational materials, housing, and approved living expenses. The beauty of the structure, Silas continued, lies in the word irrevocable. Once the ink dries, the trust cannot be modified, dissolved, or accessed by the creator or any outside parties. If your parents attempt to extract money from you, you simply point to the corporate trustee. The trustee has a legally binding fiduciary duty to deny any distribution that does not directly serve your academic needs. You legally will not possess the money to give them. The funds exist in a vacuum. It becomes an impenetrable vault. I listened to the structure of the trust and felt a profound sense of relief. It functioned like a synthetic antibody designed to neutralize the exact strain of manipulation my parents utilized. They could deploy guilt trips, fabricate emergencies, and forge documents, but all their efforts would bounce off a corporate fiduciary wall. We will set it up, Silas said. The university will route the federal disbursements directly into the trust account. Your parents can knock on your door all they want, but the house will be empty. He instructed his paralegal to draft the documents. I sat in the quiet office while the printer hummed in the background, producing the pages that would sever my financial ties to the people who raised me. As I waited, a familiar sensation crept into my chest. It was a dull, aching pressure. Guilt. For my entire life, I had been programmed to view my own independence as an act of betrayal. My parents had conditioned me to believe that a good daughter absorbs the pain of her family. To build a wall this high felt unnatural. It felt like abandoning a patient on the operating table. I closed my eyes and analyzed the emotional response. In epidemiology, you learn to distinguish between the actual disease and the immune system's overreaction to it. Sometimes the fever is just the body fighting shadows. The guilt was a phantom symptom. It was the residual programming of a lifetime spent serving as a biological cash machine. I reminded myself of the torn envelope. I pictured my mother standing at a bank teller window, trying to use my teenage appendicitis against me. The guilt dissolved and was quickly replaced by the cold, hard reality of survival. The paralegal returned with a stack of thick paper. Silas walked me through each clause. I initialed the margins, verifying the restrictions, verifying the corporate trustee appointment, and verifying that my parents held zero legal standing. A notary public entered the room. She asked for my identification and recorded my information in her ledger. I picked up a pen and signed my full name on the final signature line. The notary took the paperwork. She pressed her official seal onto the page. The heavy thud of the notary stamp echoed through the silent wood-paneled office. It was a sharp, definitive sound. It sounded exactly like a heavy steel door slamming shut and locking from the inside. The paperwork was executed. The Vaughn Educational Irrevocable Trust was now a living entity under Idaho law. I left the law office and walked back to my car. The afternoon sun felt warmer on my skin. The air tasted cleaner. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my phone. I navigated to the university registrar portal and opened the financial aid directory. I composed an email to the disbursement officer attaching the newly minted trust identification numbers and the routing details for the corporate trustee. I formally directed the university to deposit the entire fellowship directly into the protected account. I read the email twice to ensure the routing numbers were flawless. Then I pressed send. The mechanism was in place. The funds would bypass my personal identity entirely. I placed my phone in the cup holder and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking structure, the screen illuminated with a new notification. It was a text message from my mother. I tapped the screen while waiting at a red light. The message loaded in stark black and white text. "We are coming up this weekend to help you budget your grant, sweetie. We need to talk about the family." I stared at the glowing screen. They thought the money was still in transit. They thought they could arrive with smiles and manipulation and steer my future into their failing hardware store. They were preparing to drive 300 miles to harvest a crop that had already been burned to the ground. I did not reply to the message. I put the car in gear and drove toward my apartment. The trap was set. Let them come. In clinical trials, the administration of a placebo serves a distinct biological purpose. It provides a baseline. It pacifies the subject. The patient receives a harmless sugar pill, but their brain registers the intervention as a cure, and their anxiety drops. I needed to pacify my parents. The university bureaucracy required 3 business days to verify the routing numbers for the new corporate trustee. During that vulnerable window, I needed my parents to believe their manipulation was working flawlessly. If they sensed a barricade, they would escalate their attacks before the legal quarantine was fully established. I had to become the placebo. They arrived at my apartment on Sunday evening. The sun was dipping below the Boise foothills, casting long amber shadows across my living room floor. My mother knocked on the door with a bright, rhythmic pattern. I turned the deadbolt and let them inside. They brought fragrant takeout from a high-end Thai restaurant downtown. The gesture was a calculated offering. In my family, food was rarely just nourishment. It was a currency used to purchase compliance. My father walked in carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He did not look like a man facing the imminent collapse of his hardware store. He wore a crisp, button-down shirt and leather loafers. My mother carried the canvas bags of food. She wore a wide, serene smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She hugged me tightly, pressing her cheek against mine. Her perfume smelled of heavy florals and hidden desperation. We moved to the small dining table near my kitchen. My mother unpacked the containers, arranging them with practiced domestic precision. She pulled a bottle of red wine from her bag and poured 3 glasses. She slid one across the smooth wood toward me. I thanked her. I wrapped my fingers around the stem of the glass, but I did not bring it to my lips. I left the dark liquid untouched. Alcohol dulls the prefrontal cortex. It lowers inhibitions and impairs critical analysis. I needed every cognitive faculty operating at peak efficiency. The untouched glass of wine sat beside my plate, serving as a silent testament to my newfound clarity. They did not mention the money immediately. They followed the established protocol of predators circling a target. They asked polite, shallow questions about the weather and my apartment. They did not ask a single question about my epidemiological research. They did not ask about the long hours I spent in the university laboratory or the complex viral sequencing I was learning to perform. My life outside their utility was invisible to them. I was merely a vessel holding an asset they required. As we finished the meal, my father pushed his empty plate aside. The ambient tension in the room shifted. He unzipped the leather portfolio and withdrew a stack of stapled documents. He placed them in the center of the table. "Phaedra," he began, using a tone of benevolent authority. "Your mother and I have been doing a lot of thinking about your situation. Managing a federal grant of that size is a significant burden for a young woman. We want to make sure you are protected from the inevitable tax liabilities." My mother leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "We spoke to an accountant, sweetie," she said softly. "If you take that $150,000 directly, the government will penalize you. We want to shelter that money for you so you can focus entirely on your little microscope." I maintained a neutral expression. I looked at the documents on the table. They were registration papers for a limited liability company. The entity was registered under my father's name. It was an old holding company he had created years ago during a failed attempt to expand his hardware business into commercial supply. "What is the proposal?" I asked, keeping my voice flat and inquisitive. My father offered a warm, reassuring smile. "It is very simple. We wrote the CDC disbursement directly into this corporate account. By classifying the grant as business revenue under the family umbrella, we can write off the tax burden. Your mother and I will act as the financial managers. We will set you up on a generous monthly stipend to cover your rent and your groceries." He was pitching a total financial takeover. He was asking me to deposit my entire doctoral funding into a defunct corporate shell controlled exclusively by him. In exchange, he would graciously allowance my own money back to me, forcing me to beg for rent checks and laboratory fees. It was breathtaking in its arrogance. I did not argue. I did not point out that federal fellowships are typically tax-exempt or that his proposal bordered on wire fraud. I played the role of the overwhelmed daughter seeking guidance. How would the monthly disbursements work for my research materials, I asked. My mother reached out and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cool, her smile stretched thin, displaying a predatory patience. "You would just submit your receipts to your father," she murmured. "We will handle all the tedious bookkeeping. You will not have to worry about a single number. You can just be a student." I observed their micro-expressions. When my father spoke about the total sum of the grant, his pupils dilated slightly. His fingers twitched against the leather portfolio. He was already spending the capital in his mind, using it to plug the holes in his sinking business. My mother watched my face, searching for any sign of resistance. She was coiled tight, ready to deploy a guilt trip or a tearful breakdown the moment I hesitated. I gave them exactly what they needed to see. I nodded slowly. I relaxed my shoulders and exhaled a long breath. "That sounds like a very thorough plan," I said. "I appreciate you looking out for my tax liability. Leave the documents with me tonight. I will review the routing numbers and sign the authorizations in the morning." The relief that washed over them was immediate and palpable. The rigid posture of my father softened. My mother squeezed my hand and let out a bright, genuine laugh. They had cracked the vault. They believed the quiet, compliant daughter had returned to her post, ready to sacrifice her future to maintain their illusion of stability. "We are so proud of you, Phaedra," my father said. He gathered his portfolio, leaving the LLC documents neatly stacked by my untouched wine glass. "You are making a very smart decision for the family." My mother stood and wrapped her arms around me. She kissed my cheek. "We will talk tomorrow, sweetie," she whispered. "Get some rest." I walked them to the door. I watched them walk down the hallway, their steps light and energetic. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were pathogens rejoicing in a bloodstream that had already been synthesized with a terminal cure. I closed the door. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked into place. The apartment fell into a deep, ringing silence. I walked back to the dining table. I picked up the stack of LLC documents and dropped them directly into the recycling bin under the sink. I carried my untouched wine to the kitchen and poured the dark red liquid down the drain, watching it swirl and vanish. I moved to my small desk in the corner of the living room. My laptop screen was dark. I tapped the spacebar. The monitor illuminated, casting a harsh white light across my face. I opened my email client. The inbox was clear, except for one new unread message sitting at the top of the queue. The sender was the University Financial Disbursement Office. The subject line read, "Official Notice of Funds Transfer." I clicked the message. I read the plain black text on the screen. The bureaucratic language was beautiful in its precision. The federal fellowship, totaling $150,000, had cleared the final administrative hurdles. The funds had been successfully routed and deposited into the receiving account. I checked the destination routing numbers listed at the bottom of the email. They did not match my old checking account. They certainly did not match my father's defunct limited liability company. The numbers belonged to the corporate trustee of the Vaughn Educational Irrevocable Trust. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the glowing confirmation. The trap had snapped shut. The money was legally gone. It was sealed inside a vault governed by strict fiduciary laws that no amount of parental guilt could breach. The incubation period was over. The host was immune. Now all I had to do was wait for them to realize they were starving. The fluorescent lights in the university biosafety laboratory hummed a low, steady frequency. I spent my entire Thursday operating under strict quarantine protocols. 12 hours of sequencing viral mutations will leave your eyes burning and your muscles stiff. You learn to appreciate the rigid structure of a sterile environment. Everything has a designated place. Every hazard is contained behind thick glass and double-sealed airlocks. When an experiment concludes, you strip off the protective layers, wash your hands with chemical soap, and step out into the clean air. You expect the outside world to remain orderly. I drove back to my apartment complex as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks of the Boise foothills. The parking lot was mostly empty. I carried my heavy canvas bag over my shoulder, feeling the satisfying ache of a productive day. I walked up the 2 flights of concrete stairs to my floor. I approached my door and reached into my pocket for my keys. My hand stopped halfway to the lock. The deadbolt was disengaged. The brass handle hung slightly askew, indicating the door was not fully latched. A harsh tearing noise echoed from inside my living room. It was the distinct, sharp sound of heavy packing tape being ripped off a plastic dispenser. I pushed the door open. The sterile order of my life had been violated. Cardboard boxes covered the hardwood floor. My books were stripped from the shelves and stacked in haphazard towers. My throw pillows were shoved into black garbage bags. In the center of the room, my mother stood wrapping a ceramic table lamp in sheets of old newspaper. My father was near the kitchen counter, folding a large moving box into shape. They had used the spare emergency key I gave them 2 years ago. I had handed it to them during a brief period of naive optimism, believing they might visit like normal relatives. Instead, they had kept the metal object like a lockpick, waiting for the precise moment to stage a hostile takeover. My mother looked up from the lamp. She wore a bright, cheerful smile that clashed terribly with the destruction surrounding her. "Surprise," she sang out. "We wanted to get a head start before you got home from the laboratory." I stood in the doorway. I did not drop my bag. I did not shout or demand an explanation. I observed the scene with the detached focus of a researcher watching a parasite devour a host cell. Thinking the $150,000 endowment was safely routing to their defunct commercial account, they had decided to accelerate their extraction timeline. They were no longer satisfied with merely taking my capital. They wanted to consume my autonomy entirely. "What are you doing?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "We are getting you packed up, sweetheart," my mother said. She taped the newspaper securely around the ceramic base. "Your father and I discussed it on the drive back north after our lovely dinner. It makes no sense for you to waste your stipend on rent in this expensive city. We are breaking your lease. You are moving back home into your old bedroom." My father chimed in while taping the bottom of a cardboard box. "It is the most logical financial strategy, Phaedra. With the federal funds safely secured in the business account, we can maximize the return. You will not have to worry about utility bills or grocery shopping. We will take care of all your basic needs while you finish your degree online or commute. This way, every single dollar of that grant goes towards saving our store and building our collective future." They had crossed a massive psychological boundary. In their minds, my apartment was not my sanctuary. It was a temporary holding cell that cost them money. They viewed my independence as a leaky faucet draining resources that rightfully belonged to their failing enterprise. By forcing me back into my childhood bedroom, they would eliminate my overhead and ensure my total subjugation. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. I let my canvas bag slide off my shoulder and hit the floor with a dull thud. "Put the lamp down," I said. My mother chuckled a dismissive, breathy sound. "Do not be dramatic, Phaedra. We already spoke to your landlord earlier today. We told him there was a family emergency, and you needed to terminate the contract. He was very understanding once we offered to forfeit the security deposit. You spoke to my landlord," I repeated. "Yes," my father said, standing up to his full height. He tossed the tape dispenser onto the counter. "It is handled. Now grab some garbage bags from the kitchen and start emptying your closet. We rented a moving truck for tomorrow morning, and I do not want to pay for an extra day." I did not move toward the kitchen. I looked at the boxes holding my textbooks, my dishes, my framed photographs. I looked at the two people who had created me and realized they felt zero biological imperative to protect me. "You are trespassing," I stated. The words hung in the quiet apartment, cold and precise. My mother sighed loudly, acting as though she was dealing with a petulant toddler. "We are trying to help you," she said, her tone shifting to an irritated whine. "You are overwhelmed. You clearly cannot manage your own life right now. You do not live here," I continued, ignoring her narrative. "Your names are not on the lease. You entered my private residence without my consent, and you are currently tampering with my personal property. That meets the legal definition of criminal trespass." My father scoffed. The sound was thick with arrogant disbelief. He crossed the room, closing the distance between us until he stood barely a foot away. My father was a large man. He possessed broad shoulders and a heavy frame built from years of unloading hardware supplies. During my childhood, he frequently used his physical size as an instrument of compliance. He never hit me, but he knew exactly how to block a doorway, how to loom over a chair, and how to cast a shadow that made you feel incredibly small. He stepped into my personal space, attempting to trigger that old childhood fear. He stared down at me, his face twisting into a sneer of absolute authority. "You do not make the decisions here, little girl," he growled. "You think because you wear a lab coat and read big books that you are in charge. You are nothing without us. We are taking you home, and you are going to do exactly what you are told." 10 years ago, that physical proximity would have paralyzed me. I would have folded into myself, apologized, and started packing the boxes. But I was not a frightened teenager anymore. I was an epidemiologist. I understood that yielding space to an aggressive organism only guarantees your own destruction. I did not step back. I held my ground, maintaining eye contact. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my cellular phone. I unlocked the screen with a swift swipe of my thumb. Idaho is a state that takes private domains very seriously, I told him. My voice never wavered. The pitch remained deadly even. The legal system here protects a property owner above almost everything else. There is no familial exception for breaking and entering. I raised the phone, displaying the keypad. You have exactly 3 minutes, I said. You will drop the packing tape, you will put down my lamp, you will walk out that front door, and you will never use that key again. My father glared at me. Are you threatening me? He demanded. I am establishing a protocol, I replied. If you are still standing on my hardwood floor in 180 seconds, I will dial 911. I will report an active home invasion in progress by 2 hostile individuals refusing to vacate the premises. The Boise police response time for an active intrusion is incredibly fast. The silence that followed was absolute. The tearing sound of the tape dispenser was replaced by the heavy breathing of a man realizing his primary weapon had suddenly become useless. My mother dropped her hands. The newspaper wrapping slipped off the ceramic lamp and fluttered to the floor. She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. They looked at my face, searching for the compliant daughter they had manipulated for 2 decades. They searched for a trace of guilt, a flicker of hesitation, a sign that I was bluffing. They found nothing. The host had rejected the parasite. My father took a slow step backward. The sneer on his face dissolved into a look of genuine shock. He realized in that quiet, suspended moment that the quiet daughter he thought he owned had suddenly grown fangs. The countdown has started, I said. 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I stood perfectly still, watching them process the new reality. The old dynamic was dead. The containment wall was built. The only choice left for them was how badly they wanted to test the structural integrity of the glass. My father stood his ground. He crossed his arms over his chest and anchored his weight into the hardwood floor. He was betting on 2 decades of my compliance. He thought the girl who once handed over her pharmacy paychecks to keep his lights on would never actually summon law enforcement against her own blood. He smirked a sharp upward pull of his mouth. Call them, he dared me. Tell the dispatcher you are kicking your parents onto the street. I did not blink. I retrieved my device and pressed the digits on my screen. I bypassed the emergency line because this was not a panic situation. This was a removal procedure. I connected to the Boise Police Dispatch Center. The operator answered, asking the nature of my call. I spoke clearly into the receiver. I need assistance at my residence. I have 2 unauthorized individuals refusing to vacate the premises. There are no weapons involved, but they are hostile and packing my belongings against my will. My mother gasped. She rushed forward and grabbed my father by the arm. Richard, she whispered, her voice trembling with genuine alarm. She is actually doing it. He shook her off, but the smirk faded from his face. We stood in a triangular standoff for 14 minutes. I tracked the seconds on the wall clock. I did not engage in their desperate attempts to goad me into an argument. My father called me an ungrateful burden. My mother begged me to think of the family reputation. I remained a silent observer, collecting behavioral data on a pathogen, realizing its host was immune. When a virus encounters a sterile surface, it cannot feed. It simply thrashes until it expires. Blue and red lights soon sliced through the gaps in my window blinds. The flashing colors painted the living room walls in rhythmic sweeping strokes. A heavy knock sounded at the front door. I stepped around the cardboard boxes and opened it. 2 uniformed officers stood in the hallway. Their radios crackled with dispatch traffic. The older officer introduced himself as Officer Davies. He asked who had initiated the call. I raised my hand. Before I could explain the parameters of the intrusion, my mother launched her countermeasure. She bypassed me entirely and threw herself toward the officers. Tears spilled over her cheeks. Her face crumpled into a mask of pure maternal agony. "Oh, thank goodness you are here," she sobbed, clutching her cashmere cardigan. "Officers, please, you have to help us. Our daughter is having a severe mental breakdown." The younger officer stepped inside, surveying the room. He kept a hand resting near his utility belt. We drove all the way from the Panhandle because she stopped answering our calls. My mother continued, her voice breaking at precise intervals. She is under immense academic stress at the university lab. She is not sleeping. She is experiencing paranoid delusions and acting erratically. We were just trying to pack a few bags to bring her home to her doctor. To an untrained eye, the scene looked exactly like the aftermath of a manic episode. My mother played the environment to her advantage, using the destruction they had caused as visual evidence of my supposed instability. The half-packed boxes, the torn newspaper, the dismantled lamp, all pointed to a mind losing its grip on reality. She wept into her hands, delivering a flawless portrayal of a heartbroken caregiver facing an unpredictable patient. Officer Davies turned his attention to me. His gaze was assessing, searching for the frantic energy my mother had just described. He asked if I needed medical attention. He asked if I was experiencing any distress or confusion. I did not defend myself against the accusations. Arguing with a delusion only validates its premise. I operated entirely on empirical evidence. I stepped over to my kitchen counter and opened my wallet. I retrieved my Idaho driver's license, my university faculty identification card, and the printed copy of my residential lease agreement. I handed the stack of documents to Officer Davies. "I am in perfect physical and mental health, officer," I stated. My voice remained steady, measured and pitched at a conversational volume. "My name is Phaedra Vaughn. I am a doctoral researcher in epidemiology at Boise State University. I hold the sole lease on this apartment. The two individuals behind me are my parents. I did not invite them here. I did not authorize them to pack my belongings or break my lease. I asked them to leave and they refused." The officers assessed the situation. Officer Davies reviewed the documents. He checked the name on the lease against the identification card. He looked at the university badge detailing my department and clearance level. Then he looked at my face. He saw a woman standing with relaxed shoulders, maintaining direct eye contact, and speaking in complete logical sentences. He then looked back at my mother, who was still performing her theatrical weeping by the couch. The contrast was stark. In law enforcement, as in science, the calmest entity in a volatile environment is usually the one tethered to reality. A feverish patient sweats and thrashes. A healthy organism breathes evenly. I continued my debriefing. My parents are currently experiencing financial distress related to their retail business up north. They believe that by forcing me to move back into my childhood bedroom, they can redirect my federal research funding to cover their commercial debts. When I declined to fund their business, they broke into my apartment to forcibly relocate me. I want them trespassed from this property immediately. The younger officer crossed the room and instructed my parents to step away from the boxes. The tone of the interaction shifted. The deference afforded to a grieving mother vanished, replaced by the firm directives of property law enforcement. Idaho statutes prioritize the rights of the lawful tenant. The sanctity of the home is a foundational pillar here. Officer Davies handed my documents back to me. He turned to my father. "Sir, you and your wife need to exit the premises right now. You are officially trespassed from this address. If you return, you will be arrested." My mother dropped her hands from her face. The tears ceased instantly. The sudden evaporation of her grief was a chilling confirmation of her manipulative capabilities. She glared at me, her eyes narrow and cold. The mask had slipped, revealing the stark calculation beneath it. My father did not attempt to argue with the police. He knew the limits of his intimidation tactics. He could bully a compliant daughter, but he could not bully armed officers holding a signed lease agreement. He grabbed his coat from the back of the sofa. He walked toward the front door, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood. As he passed me, he paused. He leaned in close enough for me to smell the stale coffee on his breath. The facade of the worried patriarch dissolved, revealing the predatory core hiding just below the surface. He lowered his voice so the officers would not catch the exact phrasing, but I heard every syllable clearly. "You are going to regret this," he whispered. His tone carried a sharp, serrated edge. "You think you are so smart with your science and your paperwork? We will get a judge to declare you incompetent by Friday. You will not have a dime to your name when we are done with you." He stepped out into the hallway, pulling my mother along with him. The officers followed them down the stairwell, ensuring they exited the building complex. I stood in my living room surrounded by the cardboard boxes they had used to dismantle my sanctuary. The blue and red lights stopped flashing through the window blinds as the patrol car pulled out of the parking lot. The apartment returned to its quiet state, but the atmosphere remained highly charged. The threat hung in the air like an airborne pathogen waiting to be inhaled. They were no longer trying to trick me out of my resources. They were preparing to strip me of my civil rights. The battle had mutated from a domestic dispute into a legal war. If they filed for a conservatorship, they would attempt to legally erase my autonomy. I needed to fortify my defenses before the infection spread to the courthouse. The morning air held a crisp autumn bite that seeped through the window panes of my living room. I stood in my kitchen brewing a cup of dark roast coffee. The cardboard boxes were gone. My textbooks rested neatly on their designated shelves. The ceramic lamp sat on the end table, restored to its proper orientation. The environment was sterile and orderly once again. I had spent the past 48 hours decontaminating my space, scrubbing away the physical traces of my parents' hostile intrusion. A sharp knock interrupted the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I walked to the front door and checked the optical peephole. A stranger in a beige windbreaker stood in the hallway holding a thick brown parcel. He did not look like a delivery driver. He carried a clipboard and wore an expression of practiced boredom. I disengaged the deadbolt and opened the door, keeping the security chain attached. "Are you Phaedra Vaughn?" the man asked. His voice was monotone. I confirmed my identity. He slipped the heavy envelope through the gap in the doorway. "You have been served," he said. He turned away and walked down the concrete stairwell without another glance. The envelope hit the floor with a dense, unyielding thud. I stared at it for a long moment. It looked innocuous lying there on the welcome mat, but I knew better. In epidemiology, you learn that the most lethal vectors often arrive in mundane packages. A mosquito bite, a shared glass of water, a brown envelope sliding under a door. I unhooked the security chain, picked up the package, and carried it to the dining table. The paper felt unusually thick, weighing down my hands. I broke the seal and tipped the contents onto the smooth wooden surface. A stack of legal documents slid out, bound by a heavy brass staple. The header at the top of the first page was printed in stark, bold lettering, "In the District Court of the State of Idaho. Petition for emergency appointment of guardian and conservator." Below that imposing title, my own name was listed as the proposed ward. The petitioners were Richard and Brenda Vaughn. I sat down in the wooden chair. My breathing slowed as my eyes scanned the introductory paragraphs. The transition from personal hostility to judicial warfare had occurred in record time. My parents had made good on their parting threat. They were asking a judge to strip me of my legal autonomy. I turned to the supporting affidavits. Reading my mother's sworn statement felt like studying a masterclass in psychological distortion. She had constructed an intricate narrative painting me as a brilliant but fragile academic collapsing under the weight of my doctoral research. She claimed I was suffering from severe paranoia, chronic sleep deprivation, and an inability to care for my basic hygiene. She described my behavior as erratic and dangerously detached from reality. The most chilling portion of her testimony centered on the incident with the police. She had weaponized my defense mechanism against me. She testified under penalty of perjury that I had experienced a terrifying manic episode, hallucinated a break-in, and summoned armed officers to banish my loving parents who were merely trying to bring me a warm meal and maternal comfort. She twisted my calm demeanor during the police intervention into proof of a detached catatonic state. She claimed I was disassociated from my surroundings, unable to recognize the love they were offering. To a judge reading these pages without context, I sounded like a tragic case study in rapid mental decline. My mother had drafted a script designed to elicit judicial sympathy for two heartbroken caregivers trying to save their failing daughter. My father provided the financial justification in the subsequent pages. His affidavit expressed deep paternal sorrow over my inability to manage my own affairs. He cited the rigorous demands of my epidemiological fellowship, arguing that I lacked the cognitive clarity to handle complex financial instruments. I turned to page 7, where the true motive lay exposed in plain ink. Under the section detailing my assets, he had explicitly listed the Centers for Disease Control grant. He requested that the court grant him immediate protective management over those specific funds to prevent me from squandering them in my supposed state of diminished capacity. He asked for full authorization to route my income, pay my bills, and dictate my living arrangements. The sheer audacity of the petition was breathtaking. They were not trying to save me. They were orchestrating a legal heist. They wanted the state of Idaho to hand them the keys to my vault. A cold, profound sense of betrayal washed over my skin. It is one thing for toxic relatives to demand money or intrude upon your physical space. It is a profoundly different level of violation to petition a government entity to erase your personhood. In Idaho, personal autonomy is a fierce cultural cornerstone. To be placed under a conservatorship is to undergo a legal death. It would revoke my civil rights. I would lose the ability to sign a lease consent to medical treatment, direct my own career, or manage my own bank accounts. I would be reduced to the status of a perpetual child. They were willing to inflict this permanent destruction upon their own daughter simply to cover their retail debts. The magnitude of their greed was a parasitic infection that had consumed their basic humanity. I felt a slight tremor in my fingers. The human instinct in this scenario is to cry. It is normal to scream at the injustice, to call the perpetrators, and demand an explanation for their cruelty. The body wants to release the pressure of the betrayal through a visceral emotional reaction. But I am a scientist. I do not fight a mutating virus with emotion. I stared at the thick stack of perjury. A pathogen survives by overwhelming the host before the immune system can mount a targeted response. My parents filed an emergency petition, hoping the speed of the legal system would crush my defenses before I could organize a countermeasure. They wanted me to appear in court frantic, angry, and weeping. If I walked into that courtroom shouting about their lies, I would play right into their narrative. I would provide the judge with the exact erratic behavior they had described in their affidavits. I would not give them that satisfaction. You fight a biological threat with empirical data. I needed to construct an impenetrable shield of clinical evidence. I needed to prove my sanity, my professional competence, and my unshakable grasp on reality. To do that, I could not rely on my own testimony. A targeted host cannot just declare themselves healthy. I needed objective professional witnesses with impeccable credentials to vouch for my cognitive function. I reached across the table and picked up my phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my contacts directory. I dialed the number for Silas Thorne, the estate attorney who had drafted my protective trust. He needed to know the financial quarantine was under judicial attack and that we needed to prepare a defense for the upcoming emergency hearing. As the line rang, I mentally drafted my next steps. After I spoke with Silas, my subsequent call would be to Dr. Eris Thorne, the director of my university laboratory. I needed to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation. I needed sworn statements attesting to my daily performance handling high-stakes viral samples. I needed clinical proof of my sanity, and I needed it on the legal record before the end of the week. The waiting room of Dr. Evelyn Reed felt deliberately benign. Muted watercolor paintings hung on pale walls, depicting soft landscapes designed to lower the heart rate of anxious patients. A white noise machine hummed quietly near the solid oak door, providing an auditory blanket for the private conversations happening inside. I sat in a structured armchair and watched the second hand of the wall clock sweep in a continuous, smooth motion. Silas Thorne had arranged this appointment within an hour of my frantic phone call. He understood the urgency of the legal mechanism my parents had deployed. To defeat a conservatorship petition based on fabricated mental instability, I needed a preemptive diagnostic evaluation from a board-certified forensic psychiatrist. I needed a recognized medical expert to formally declare my mind sound. Dr. Reed opened the door and called my name. I followed her into a brightly lit office that smelled faintly of green tea and sterilized fabric. She sat behind a polished wooden desk and clicked the top of her silver pen. The sound was a sharp, metallic tick. It echoed in the quiet room, signaling the official start of the examination. The assessment began with standard cognitive testing. Dr. Reed did not offer warm smiles or comforting platitudes. Her demeanor was entirely clinical. She administered tests measuring my short-term memory, recall, my spatial reasoning, and my logical deduction capabilities. I completed the puzzles and answered the sequences with rapid precision. My brain was trained to process complex epidemiological data, so these baseline neurological exams required minimal effort. Then the examination shifted to a clinical interview. The minor conflict of this procedure was the profound vulnerability it demanded. I am a private person. I protect my internal state with the same rigor I use to secure biohazard materials in the laboratory. Sitting in that chair answering invasive questions about my childhood trauma felt like exposing a fresh wound to unfiltered air. I fought the deep exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. Maintaining a grueling academic schedule while defending my civil rights against my own family was draining my physical and mental reserves. My body wanted to shut down and sleep. I suppressed the urge to retreat. I treated the evaluation exactly like a clinical trial. In scientific research, you must present all the variables honestly to achieve an accurate result. Concealing data corrupts the findings. I stripped away my defensive posturing and spoke with total transparency. I detailed the financial exploitation I had endured since I was a teenager working at the local pharmacy. I described the fake hardware store foreclosure my father had tried to use to extract $20,000. I outlined the attempted bank account hijack where my mother presented an expired medical power of attorney. Finally, I recounted the physical intrusion at my apartment and the subsequent police intervention. I kept my voice level and stripped the narrative of emotional bias. I simply presented the timeline of their actions. The sharp tick of the pen sounded repeatedly as Dr. Reed took meticulous notes on a yellow legal pad. She observed my posture, my eye contact, and my speech patterns. She was searching for signs of the paranoia and detachment my mother had sworn I possessed. When I finished recounting the events leading to the court petition, she set her pen down. "You are demonstrating remarkable resilience, Miss Vaughn," she said. Her tone carried the weight of professional certainty. "The symptoms your parents described in their affidavits simply do not exist. You are perfectly lucid. You are experiencing a natural physiological stress response to a sustained campaign of financial abuse. It is a textbook case of familial exploitation." She promised to expedite her final report. She assured me her sworn statement would confirm I possessed exceptional cognitive clarity and the full mental capacity to manage my own affairs. I left her office feeling a heavy weight lift from my shoulders. The first layer of my defense was secured by a medical professional. My next stop was the University Science Building. The air inside the research facility was cool and heavily filtered. I walked down the long linoleum corridor to the office of Dr. Eris Thorne. He served as the director of the epidemiology department and my primary research supervisor. Dr. Thorne was a demanding mentor who tolerated zero errors in his facility. He demanded perfection because the viral samples we handled could cause catastrophic outbreaks if mismanaged. I knocked on his door and entered. He sat surrounded by towering stacks of peer-reviewed research journals and data printouts. I handed him the draft affidavit my lawyer Silas had prepared earlier that morning. I explained the situation using the fewest words possible. I told him my parents were attempting to freeze my fellowship funding by questioning my mental fitness and claiming academic burnout. Dr. Thorne adjusted his wire-framed spectacles and read the legal document. His expression hardened into a rigid line of professional outrage. He picked up his own fountain pen and began amending the document, crossing out the generic legal jargon and adding specific details about my daily performance in the laboratory. He wrote that I routinely operated Level 3 biosafety equipment with flawless execution. He noted my ability to analyze complex datasets under intense pressure. He explicitly stated that any person capable of maintaining my level of meticulous focus in a hazardous laboratory environment was unequivocally of sound mind. He signed his name at the bottom of the page, pressing hard enough to leave a visible indentation in the thick paper. "No one touches my researchers' funding," he stated, handing the paper back to me. "You bring this to the judge. You let them know the university stands behind your work and your competence." I thanked him and returned to my apartment as dusk settled over the city. I sat on my couch and arranged the documents on the wooden coffee table. I gathered the psychiatric evaluation summary, the laboratory director affidavit, the police report from the trespass incident, and the banking records showing my parents' failed login attempts. I placed each document into a clear protective sleeve and organized them inside a heavy-duty black binder. I was building a fortress of paper. Every sheet was a brick designed to repel the false narrative my parents had constructed for the court. With my defense assembled, I shifted my focus back to their conservatorship petition. I needed to understand their overarching legal strategy. I picked up the thick stack of court filings and began a secondary, rigorous review. I read past the emotional manipulation, the dramatic storytelling, and the feigned parental concern. I focused entirely on the financial disclosures they were required to submit to the judge. To be appointed as a conservator in the state of Idaho, an applicant must prove to the court that they are fiscally responsible and capable of managing a ward. My parents had attached a summary of their assets and liabilities to demonstrate their financial stability. They listed the hardware store valuing the business far above its actual market worth. They listed their primary residence in northern Idaho and 2 modest retirement accounts. I scanned the columns of numbers. My training as a researcher compels me to look for anomalies in large data sets. The human eye tends to skip over footnotes and tiny print, but those hidden margins are where the true variables reside. I reached the final page of their financial schedule. At the very bottom, buried beneath a list of standard business expenses and utility bills, I spotted a single line of text. It was a disclosure of a secondary liability. The text identified a holding entity named Cascade Summit Properties. I frowned and leaned closer to the page, tracing the line with my index finger. I had grown up reviewing the ledgers for the family hardware business. I knew every vendor, every supplier, and every utility provider my parents used. I had never seen the name Cascade Summit Properties. It was listed as a shell company tied to a substantial monthly outbound payment. The amount was staggering. It far exceeded the revenue the struggling hardware store could generate. The puzzle piece clicked into place with a resounding finality. My father had claimed the store was facing a tax foreclosure, but the county records had proven that was a lie. Yet they were desperate enough to commit perjury in a legal document and attempt a judicial kidnapping to secure my $150,000 grant. They did not need the money to save the hardware store. They needed the money to feed something else entirely, something large and hidden from public view. I picked up my laptop and opened a new secure browser window. I accessed the state business registry portal and typed the name of the shell company into the search bar. The system processed the query and generated a list of corporate filings. The results loaded on the screen, and the true nature of their panic revealed itself in plain text. I was no longer just building a defensive wall. I had just found the weapon I needed to destroy their entire case. The search results for the shell company loaded on my screen in stark black text. The State Business Registry portal is a sterile environment devoid of emotion or narrative. It provides only raw data. I stared at the corporate filings for Cascade Summit Properties. The registered agent was Richard Vaughn. The filing date was recorded as 24 months ago. In epidemiology, contact tracing requires moving backward from the infected host to the original source. I applied this exact methodology to my parents' financial footprint. I cross-referenced the timeline. 2 years ago was the precise period when my father began complaining loudly about declining retail traffic at the hardware store. Instead of adjusting his business model or managing his inventory, he had searched for an effortless escape hatch. I recalled the summer I turned 17, working double shifts at the local pharmacy to pay for my own science textbooks. My father had spent that same summer attending wealth-building seminars in cheap hotel conference rooms, leaving my mother to juggle the overdue utility bills. They possessed a persistent vulnerability to easy money schemes. They believed wealth was a trick you could learn rather than a structure you had to build. That fundamental flaw in their logic made them perfect hosts for a predatory infection. I followed the corporate registration to a parent organization. The digital trail led across the state border into Washington. Using county property tax databases, I located the physical assets tied to the shell company. Cascade Summit Properties held the deeds to 3 parcels in a remote mountain town known for seasonal tourism. The properties were listed as short-term vacation rentals. I dug deeper into the umbrella organization holding the primary mortgages. It was a multi-level marketing scheme disguised as an elite real estate investment seminar. The founders preyed on struggling business owners and vulnerable retirees. They promised exponential passive income through highly leveraged property acquisitions. My parents had purchased the premium seminar packages. They had bought into the illusion of effortless wealth. They mortgaged their remaining credibility to acquire overpriced cabins that sat empty and unrented for 9 months of the year. I downloaded the recorded deeds of trust attached to the parcels. The commercial loans carried brutal predatory lending terms. The interest rates were adjustable and steep. I calculated the principal balances using a digital amortization schedule on my secondary monitor. $198,000, nearly $200,000 of high-interest debt secured by properties generating zero revenue. I scrolled down to the payment schedule clauses. The lenders had structured the agreements with balloon payments. A significant portion of the principal became due at the end of a short-term cycle. I checked the dates on the legal filings. The balloon payments were due on the final business day of this current month. The exact same month my federal fellowship was scheduled to disperse into my accounts. The timeline aligned with devastating precision. The fabricated tax foreclosure at the hardware store was a test. The demand for a $20,000 bridge loan was a probe. The attempt to forge my signature at the bank was an escalation. The physical ambush at my apartment was an act of desperation. The conservatorship petition claiming I was mentally unfit was their final nuclear option. None of it was about my health. None of it was about saving the family hardware business. It was a calculated, frantic scramble to secure a bailout before their real estate house of cards collapsed, taking their primary residence down with it. I sat back in the glow of the monitor. A strange physical sensation settled over my skin. It was the total absence of grief. For a child to realize their parents do not love them is usually a devastating psychological blow. But for a scientist, a clear data point is liberating regardless of how ugly the truth appears. I was never a daughter to them. I was a biological cash machine. They raised me to be hyper-competent so they could harvest my resources when their own reckless decisions caught up with them. My federal grant was the cure they needed to survive the infection they had willingly injected into their own financial system. They were willing to strip me of my civil rights to extract the antidote. The rhythmic hum of the printer broke the silence in the apartment. I sent every document to the output tray. The machine pulled fresh sheets of paper and coated them in warm black toner. The sound was steady and industrious. It sounded like the gears of a trap slowly clicking into place. I stood by the desk and collected the pages as they emerged. The articles of incorporation for Cascade Summit Properties came first. The predatory deeds of trust from Washington State followed. The loan schedules displaying the impending balloon payments printed next. The multi-level marketing promotional materials proving the fraudulent nature of the investment scheme completed the stack. I carried the warm paper to the wooden coffee table. I retrieved a heavy-duty hole punch and aligned the edges. I pressed down on the metal lever driving the steel cylinders through the paper. I opened the thick black binder containing my psychiatric evaluation and the affidavit from my laboratory director. I added a new tab divider labeled Financial Motive. I placed the newly printed evidence behind the plastic tab, snapping the metal rings closed. The sound echoed in the quiet room. The binder was now a complete anatomy of a fraud. It held the diagnosis, the symptoms, and the underlying pathology of my parents' greed. I spent the next 2 days refining my presentation. I memorized the dates, the loan amounts, and the exact sequence of their desperate actions. I did not speak to anyone outside of my legal counsel, Silas Thorne, and my laboratory supervisor, Dr. Eris Thorne. I maintained a strict regimen of sleep and hydration. Going into a hostile environment requires peak physical and cognitive readiness. You do not walk into a contaminated zone without securing your personal protective equipment. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with a cold gray sky overhead. I woke before the alarm sounded. I went through my morning routine with deliberate slowness. I drank a full glass of water. I brushed my hair back, securing it tightly away from my face. I walked into the bedroom and put on a tailored charcoal blazer and a crisp white shirt. The fabric felt structured and heavy, like armor. I stood in front of the full-length mirror on the closet door and adjusted the collar of the blazer. I inspected my reflection. There were no dark circles under my eyes. There was no tremor in my hands. My breathing was slow and even. I looked exactly like what I was. I was a highly trained professional prepared to deliver a fatal diagnosis to a systemic infection. I walked to the kitchen counter and picked up the black binder. The weight of the paper felt substantial in my grip. I slid the binder into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass clasps shut. I picked up my car keys and walked toward the front door. The pathogen had been identified. Its transmission vectors were mapped. Its true motive was thoroughly documented. The disease was fully isolated. Now it was time to eradicate it. The heavy oak doors of the family court chamber swung shut, sealing us inside a space defined by polished mahogany and rigid procedural rules. The architecture of the Idaho judicial system is designed to intimidate. The high ceilings and dark wood paneling project an atmosphere of unwavering authority. I sat at the defense table next to my attorney, Silas Thorne. My posture mirrored the structured environment around me. I kept my hands resting flat on the surface of the table beside my leather briefcase. At the petitioner's table just a few feet away sat my parents. They had dressed meticulously for their performance. My mother wore a modest charcoal blazer over a high-necked blouse, projecting the image of a respectable citizen forced into a tragic situation. My father wore a muted navy suit, sitting with his shoulders slightly slumped to convey the heavy burden of a heartbroken patriarch. Their attorney Vance sat between them, arranging his legal pads with brisk, confident movements. Judge Harrison entered the room. He was a stern-looking man with silver hair and a reputation for prioritizing family preservation. He took his seat at the elevated bench and signaled for the proceedings to begin. The strategy my parents employed was a synchronized emotional assault. In a laboratory setting, when a researcher wants to force a rapid cellular reaction, they introduce a catalyst to spike the temperature of the environment. My parents intended to flood the courtroom with so much synthetic grief that the judge would abandon objective logic and rule based on pure human sympathy. Vance stood and delivered his opening remarks. His voice echoed through the silent chamber, painting a vivid portrait of a brilliant young researcher collapsing under the weight of academic pressure. He spoke of mental fragility and the tragic deterioration of a once promising mind. He then called his first witness to the stand. My mother walked to the witness box. Her steps were slow and measured. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, with a fragile, trembling voice. She sat in the wooden chair and looked up at the judge. The performance commenced immediately. Vance guided her through a series of rehearsed questions. She recounted the narrative she had outlined in her sworn affidavits. She described how I had withdrawn from the family, isolating myself in my apartment and refusing their phone calls. She spun the narrative of my financial independence, turning my refusal to fund their hardware store into a symptom of paranoid delusion. She claimed I believed my own parents were trying to steal from me, framing my boundaries as evidence of a detached break from reality. Then came the centerpiece of her testimony. Vance asked her to describe the evening they visited my apartment. My mother lowered her head. Her shoulders shook with silent, orchestrated sobs. She reached into her pocket and retrieved a small white tissue. She waited for a precise, calculated second before dabbing the corner of her eye. The timing of the gesture was flawless. It was a masterclass in engineered vulnerability. "We only wanted to bring her home," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. She was living in squalor, terrified of her own shadow. When we tried to help her pack a bag, she became hysterical. She hallucinated a home invasion. She called the police on her own father. It was the most heartbreaking thing I have ever witnessed. My little girl looked right through me like I was a stranger. She looked directly at Judge Harrison as a fresh tear spilled over her cheek. "She is losing her grip on reality, Your Honor. If you do not let us intervene, she is going to destroy her own life." I sat beside Silas and watched the judge. I observed his facial expressions, the softening of his jaw, the sympathetic tilt of his head. The emotional temperature in the room was rising rapidly. The fever was taking hold. My mother was successfully infecting the tribunal with her fabricated sorrow. Silas remained perfectly still beside me. He did not object to her characterizations. He did not interrupt her theatrical display. We allowed the pathogen to multiply unchecked because we knew the cures sitting in my briefcase required them to expose their entire fraudulent pathology first. My mother stepped down, wiping her face, and returned to the petitioner's table. My father took the stand next. If my mother was the emotional catalyst, my father was the pragmatist, sent to seal the trap. He played the role of the stoic protector. His voice was deep and resonant, conveying a reluctant sorrow. He corroborated every lie my mother had just entered into the record. He spoke about his pride in my academic achievements and his devastating realization that the pressure had finally broken my mind. Vance skillfully steered the testimony toward the financial objective. He asked my father to explain why the conservatorship required immediate emergency jurisdiction. My father looked at the judge with weary solemnity. "Phaedra has been awarded a highly prestigious federal fellowship," he explained. "The funding is a significant sum intended to sustain her doctoral research over several years. In her current manic state, she lacks the cognitive capacity to manage these resources. We are terrified she will squander the grant or fall victim to predators." He leaned forward, gripping the edges of the witness stand. "We are not asking to take her money, Your Honor. We are simply asking for the legal authority to place those funds into a secure family-managed holding account. We need to administer her living expenses and ensure her academic future is preserved until she regains her sanity." The pivot was seamless. He had taken a blatant attempt at financial theft and dressed it in the noble garments of paternal duty. He presented himself as the reluctant savior, willing to shoulder the heavy burden of managing my wealth for my own protection. I kept my face a mask of professional calm. Inside, I marveled at the sheer audacity of their strategy. They were mere days away from defaulting on a nearly $200,000 real estate debt tied to a multi-level marketing scam. They were staring down the barrel of total financial ruin, yet they sat in a court of law, projecting an aura of infinite stability. Vance concluded his questioning and allowed my father to step down. The lawyer stood in the center of the room, buttoning his suit jacket. He projected the smug confidence of a man who believed the verdict was already secured. "Your Honor," Vance said, directing his attention to the bench, "the petitioners have demonstrated a clear and present danger to the proposed ward. Her erratic behavior and severe paranoia threaten to derail her promising career. More importantly, her inability to manage her impending federal endowment poses a catastrophic risk to her future security." Vance gestured toward the defense table. "We respectfully request that this court grant an immediate emergency injunction. We ask that the university financial accounts be frozen today and that my clients be granted full conservatorship authority to seize and manage the fellowship funds before they are lost to this tragic mental decline." The lawyer returned to his seat. My mother reached out and squeezed my father's hand. They exchanged a brief, triumphant glance. They believed the trap had snapped shut. They believed the money was finally within their grasp. The courtroom was silent, save for the scratching of the court reporter's transcription machine. Judge Harrison looked down at his notes, preparing to speak. The fever in the room had reached its peak. Silas Thorne stood up. He moved with a calm, deliberate grace. He adjusted his silk tie and smoothed the lapels of his suit. He did not project urgency or outrage. He projected the cool, sterile authority of a surgeon stepping up to the operating table. "Your Honor." Silas began, his voice cutting through the heavy, emotional atmosphere like a scalpel. "The defense recognizes the profound concern the petitioners have expressed regarding my client's financial security. However, before the court rules on freezing any university accounts or transferring any assets, we believe it is necessary to establish the actual legal status of the funds in question." Judge Harrison paused, looking at Silas over the rim of his reading glasses. "Proceed, counselor," the judge instructed. "We have a single witness who can provide immediate clarity on the location and jurisdiction of the fellowship disbursement," Silas said. "We call the university registrar to the stand." The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A woman in a tailored gray dress suit walked down the center aisle. It was Helen, the registrar from Boise State University. Her heels clicked a sharp, rhythmic cadence against the hardwood floor. She carried a thick, sealed manila folder tucked securely under her arm. I watched my parents as the registrar approached the witness box. The triumphant smiles faded from their faces. Their lawyer frowned, sifting quickly through his notes, trying to understand the sudden variable introduced into his pristine equation. The temperature in the room began to drop. The fever was about to break. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, pulling a draft of cool air into the stifling chamber. Helen, the university registrar, walked down the center aisle. She wore a tailored gray suit and carried a thick, sealed manila folder, tucked securely under her right arm. Her heels struck the polished hardwood floor in a sharp, rhythmic cadence that cut through the tense silence. I watched my parents track her movement. The triumphant smiles they had worn just moments earlier began to falter. They exchanged a swift, uncertain glance. Their lawyer Vance frowned and sifted rapidly through his legal pads, trying to understand the sudden variable introduced into his pristine equation. The bailiff directed Helen to the witness box. She raised her right hand, swore to provide truthful testimony, and took her seat beside the elevated bench. She adjusted the microphone, drawing it closer to her face. Silas Thorne stood up from the defense table. He buttoned his suit jacket, moving with the calm, deliberate grace of a surgeon stepping up to an operating table. He approached the witness stand and asked Helen to state her full name and professional title for the official record. Helen leaned into the microphone. "I am the Senior Disbursement Officer for Graduate Endowments at Boise State University," she stated. Her voice was clear and carried a dry, bureaucratic authority. Silas paced slowly, maintaining a measured distance. He asked her to confirm the status of the Centers for Disease Control Fellowship awarded to Phaedra Vaughn. Helen opened her folder. She retrieved a watermarked document bearing the official seal of the University Financial Office. She confirmed the federal award. She stated the total amount approved for the doctoral candidate was $150,000. The reaction at the petitioner's table was immediate. Vance sat up straighter. His eyes gained a hungry, sharp focus at the prospect of billable hours secured by a large liquid asset. My father let out a long, slow breath, gripping the edge of the table as if anchoring himself to the incoming wealth. My mother adjusted her posture, radiating a vindicated sorrow. They believed the prize was sitting on a silver platter, waiting for the judge to hand them the carving knife. Silas paused, letting their anticipation peak. He then asked Helen if the federal funds had been released by the government. Helen checked her ledger. The capital was released on the first of the month, she confirmed. Vance smiled a tight, confident expression. He jotted a quick note on his legal pad and pushed it toward my father. The trap was supposedly complete. Silas turned his body slightly facing the judge while still addressing the witness. "Could you please explain to the court exactly where the university deposited those federal funds?" he asked. Helen flipped to the second page in her file. "The funds were not deposited into a standard student banking profile," she explained. "Prior to the disbursement window, Miss Vaughn executed a legally binding routing mandate. The entire sum was wired directly to an external financial entity." Vance stopped writing. His pen hovered above the yellow paper. The confident smile vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden rigid tension. Silas stepped closer to the witness box. "Please identify the receiving entity for the public record." Helen read the routing destination with slow, precise articulation. The funds were deposited in their entirety into the Vaughn Educational Irrevocable Trust. The account is managed exclusively by a designated corporate trustee located here in downtown Boise. The courtroom remained perfectly still. The heavy oak walls seemed to absorb the sound, leaving only the sharp echo of the truth hanging in the air. Silas turned to Judge Harrison. He used his resonant voice to translate the bureaucratic reality into an impenetrable legal fortress. "Your Honor," Silas said, meeting the judge's gaze. "As the registrar has confirmed, my client does not hold direct ownership of the fellowship capital. The money resides within a strictly governed fiduciary vehicle. Miss Vaughn is merely a designated beneficiary. She cannot withdraw cash, she cannot liquidate the principal, she cannot redirect the assets to unauthorized parties." Silas pivoted slowly, directing his attention to the petitioner's table. Therefore, he continued, even if this court were to grant a full conservatorship today, that order would carry zero jurisdiction over the trust. A conservator can only manage assets the ward actually owns. My client does not own this money. The corporate trustee is bound by Idaho state law to deny any distribution request that does not originate directly from a verified academic institution or a registered housing provider. The biological equivalent of this moment is the introduction of a targeted synthetic antibody into a compromised bloodstream. The pathogen encounters a chemical barrier it cannot dissolve. The infection stops spreading and immediately begins to starve. I observed the reaction at the opposing table. The clinical breakdown of their panic was mesmerizing. The color drained from my father's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stared at the witness stand, his mouth slightly open, unable to process the architectural perfection of the barricade. The imaginary bridge loan he had plotted to save his fraudulent real estate investment dissolved into dust. The federal bailout he had counted on was locked behind a steel door he could never open. My mother reacted physically. Her hands dropped from her lap and clamped onto the edge of the mahogany table. Her knuckles turned stark white. She leaned forward, her carefully constructed mask of maternal sorrow cracking to reveal the raw, frantic panic beneath it. She looked at Vance, demanding a legal intervention that the attorney was powerless to provide. Vance was experiencing a profound professional crisis. He stared at the documents on his desk and then turned to glare at my parents. In the legal profession, an attorney relies on the accuracy of the disclosures provided by their clients. My parents had hired him to seize a vulnerable bank account. They had assured him the capital was liquid and accessible. They had lied to him by omission because they had arrogantly assumed I was too passive to execute a sophisticated financial maneuver. Vance realized he had just filed an emergency injunction to seize a vault that contained nothing but echoes. Judge Harrison leaned over the elevated bench. He peered down at the petitioner's lawyer. His expression had hardened into a mask of judicial displeasure. "Counselor," the judge said, his tone laced with a dangerous chill, "your entire emergency petition centers on the urgent necessity to protect this specific financial asset from squander. Are you telling this court you filed an emergency motion to seize an irrevocable trust you have zero legal authority to touch?" Vance stood up. His arrogant posture had evaporated. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, attempting to salvage his credibility. "Your Honor, we were not informed of this financial structure. My clients operated under the good faith belief that the funds were deposited into a standard personal checking account. Silas did not let the excuse stand. Ignorance of a financial structure does not justify filing a fraudulent petition to strip a woman of her civil rights, Silas countered smoothly. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I felt the ambient temperature of the room stabilize. The fever that had gripped the courtroom, the synthetic emotional heat generated by my mother's, tears broke entirely. The judge was no longer looking at a heartbroken family trying to save a troubled daughter. He was looking at a pair of desperate opportunists who had weaponized his courtroom for a financial heist that was mathematically impossible to execute. My parents had spent thousands of dollars retaining a predatory litigator. They had paid filing fees, process servers, and consultation charges. They had burned their remaining credit, hoping the legal maneuver would yield a $150,000 payout. Instead, they had purchased front-row seats to their own financial execution. The silence stretched further as the reality of their failure settled over the room. Judge Harrison picked up his wooden gavel. He struck the sound block once. The sharp, echoing thud reverberated through the chamber. It was the sound of a heavy door slamming shut on their future. The initial threat was neutralized. The virus could not access the host resources. But quarantine is only the first step in a thorough epidemiological response. Once you isolate the pathogen, you must expose the source of the outbreak to prevent a future resurgence. My parents were still sitting in the courtroom pretending they had filed the petition out of misguided love. They were still clinging to the narrative that they were financially stable citizens attempting a rescue mission. They thought the humiliation of the trust reveal was the worst outcome they would face today. They did not realize I had spent the past 3 days tracing their infection back to its exact origin. The financial firewall had protected my money. Now it was time to deploy the cure that would permanently destroy their credibility. I reached down and placed my hand on the leather handle of my briefcase. The thick black binder resting inside contained the multi-level marketing contracts, the predatory lending agreements, and the impending balloon payment schedules. The disease had been isolated, but the autopsy was about to begin. The echo of the wooden gavel faded into the high-vaulted ceiling of the courtroom. The immediate financial threat had been neutralized by the revelation of the trust, but the legal procedure was not yet finished. In an epidemiological study, neutralizing the active viral replication is only the first phase of containment. You must also eradicate the lingering traces of the pathogen to prevent secondary infections. My parents had placed sworn affidavits on the public record accusing me of severe cognitive decline. If those documents remained unchallenged, they could threaten my academic standing and my future career in public health. The financial shield protected my money, but I needed a clinical autopsy to protect my name. Vance stood at the petitioner's table and attempted to perform damage control. He addressed Judge Harrison, proposing that since the primary asset was unavailable, his clients were willing to withdraw the emergency petition without prejudice. He framed it as a graceful exit for a family that simply misunderstood a complex financial routing structure. He wanted to pack up his briefcase and walk away, leaving the toxic allegations hanging in the judicial atmosphere. Silas Thorne did not allow the retreat. He stood tall at the defense table and informed the court that we firmly objected to a voluntary dismissal. He stated that the petitioners had weaponized the judicial system using fraudulent medical claims to attempt a financial hijacking. Silas insisted that the court examine the evidence we had prepared to definitively rule on my competency and expose the true motive behind the filing. Judge Harrison nodded, signaling for Silas to proceed. The judge leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms. His initial sympathy for a weeping mother had evaporated, replaced by the sharp, skeptical focus of a magistrate realizing he had almost been manipulated. Silas reached down and opened my leather briefcase. He retrieved the thick, black binder containing the 23-page financial dossier and the medical affidavits. The heavy plastic covers made a solid slapping sound as he placed the binder on the mahogany table. He opened the rings and extracted the first set of documents. The crisp rustle of the thick parchment paper amplified in the silent room. Silas approached the bailiff and handed over the forensic psychiatric evaluation prepared by Dr. Evelyn Reed. He explained that I had voluntarily submitted to a rigorous cognitive and psychological assessment less than 48 hours ago. He recited the clinical findings for the court record. The evaluation explicitly stated that I possessed exceptional mental clarity, demonstrated zero signs of paranoia, and operated with full emotional stability. Dr. Reed had documented that my physical exhaustion was a normal physiological response to an ongoing campaign of familial financial abuse. The judge read the psychiatric summary. He turned the page and reviewed the credentials of the evaluating physician. The contrast was devastating. My mother had offered the court theatrical tears and vague stories about academic burnout. We offered the court a board-certified medical diagnosis proving my sanity. Silas then submitted the sworn affidavit from Dr. Eris Thorne, my university laboratory director. He summarized the contents detailing my daily responsibilities handling hazardous biological materials. Silas pointed out that my research required a level of meticulous, sustained focus that would be biologically impossible for someone experiencing a manic break from reality. The university stood firmly behind my cognitive fitness and professional excellence. My parents sat frozen at their table. Their entire narrative of a fragile daughter losing her grip on reality crumbled under the weight of empirical evidence. They had built their case on shadows, and we had just flooded the room with clinical light. With my competency firmly established, Silas pivoted to the final phase of the operation. He moved to expose the underlying pathology of the infection. Silas directed the attention of the judge to the financial schedule my parents had submitted with their original petition. He walked over to the exhibit screen and displayed the final page of their disclosure. He pointed to the single line of text buried in the footnotes. He highlighted the name Cascade Summit Properties. He informed the court that the petitioners had portrayed themselves as stable, prosperous citizens seeking to protect their child from financial ruin. He stated that this portrayal was a calculated perjury. Silas handed the bailiff the contact tracing dossier I had compiled. He submitted the corporate registry filings from Washington State, proving my father was the registered agent for the shell company. He submitted the recorded deeds of trust for the 3 overpriced vacation cabins. He then submitted the amortization schedules detailing the adjustable rate commercial loans. Silas walked the judge through the timeline, matching the financial data to my parents' escalating hostility. He explained that the petitioners were currently holding nearly $200,000 in high-interest debt tied to a predatory real estate investment scheme. He directed the judge's eyes to the balloon payment clauses. He noted that a catastrophic principal payment was due on the final business day of the current month. The math was undeniable. Silas stated that the balloon payment deadline perfectly coincided with the exact week my federal fellowship was scheduled to disperse. My father turned a sickly shade of gray. He slumped backward in his chair, staring at the projected documents. His secret desperation was now a matter of public record. My mother stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath her skin. They were no longer the aggrieved caregivers. They were exposed as desperate debtors, caught attempting to drain a relative's blood to survive their own self-inflicted wounds. Silas laid out the complete sequence of events. He detailed how they fabricated a tax foreclosure at their hardware store to ask for a bridge loan. He explained how my mother attempted to use an expired teenage medical directive to hijack my bank account when the loan was denied. He described the physical ambush at my apartment and the subsequent police removal. They did not file this emergency petition to protect their daughter. Silas concluded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. They filed this petition to execute a coordinated financial bailout. They intended to use a court-ordered conservatorship to seize federal research funds and funnel that capital into a failing real estate scam. They lied to this court about their motives, and they lied to this court about my client's mental health. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt completely sterile. Every trace of the emotional manipulation my mother had introduced was eradicated by the sheer volume of verifiable data. Judge Harrison leaned over the elevated bench. He removed his reading glasses and stared directly at my parents. In Idaho, the legal system treats the unprovoked restriction of personal autonomy as a profound offense. Weaponizing the family court to execute a financial crime against a dependent is considered an egregious violation of judicial integrity. The judge's demeanor shifted from neutral observation to cold fury. He did not raise his voice, but his tone carried a sharp, serrated edge that seemed to lower the temperature in the room. He addressed my father and mother directly. He stated that in his decades on the bench, he had rarely witnessed such a cynical and predatory abuse of the conservatorship process. He told them they had attempted to manipulate the machinery of justice to cover their own reckless gambling. He dressed them down, stripping away their respectable facades and labeling their actions as disgraceful and parasitic. He noted that the only individuals in the courtroom displaying erratic, delusional, and dangerous behavior were the petitioners themselves. He stated that their willingness to permanently damage their daughter's professional reputation and strip her of her civil rights for a real estate bailout demonstrated a complete lack of parental fitness and basic human decency. Judge Harrison picked up his pen and signed the order resting on his desk. He announced his ruling with swift definitive strikes. He dismissed the emergency petition for guardianship and conservatorship entirely. He did not just dismiss it, he dismissed it with prejudice, meaning they could never refile the claim in his jurisdiction. He formally declared that I was of sound mind and fully capable of managing my own personal and financial affairs. Then he delivered the final consequence. Because the court found the petition to be frivolous, fraudulent, and filed in bad faith, Judge Harrison ordered the petitioners to pay all legal fees and associated costs incurred by the defense. He instructed Silas to submit an itemized billing statement by the end of the week. My parents would be held financially liable for every dollar I had spent defending myself against their lies. The judge struck his gavel one final time. The sharp crack echoed through the chamber, signaling the official termination of the proceedings. My parents sat immobilized at their table. They were thoroughly ruined. They had walked into the building expecting to walk out with $150,000. Instead, they were leaving with their massive real estate debt, still looming a new order, forcing them to pay my expensive attorney, and their public reputation permanently shattered. They had lost their leverage, they had lost their daughter, and they had lost their dignity. I did not look at them. I did not offer a parting word, a gloating smile, or a tear of relief. A scientist does not celebrate when a hazardous specimen is finally secured in a waste receptacle. They simply clean their workstation and prepare for the next protocol. I remained seated at the defense table. I reached over and gathered the remaining documents. I slid the thick black binder back into my leather briefcase. I closed the lid and fastened the brass clasps. The metallic click was the only sound I contributed to the aftermath. I picked up my briefcase, pushed my chair in, and turned toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom, ready to step out into the crisp Idaho air. The crisp snap of latex gloves echoed in the sterile quiet of the University Biosafety Laboratory. I stood at my stainless steel workstation and adjusted the fine focus dial on the compound microscope. The subtle turn of the metal knob brought the cellular structures into sharp relief. I was examining a culture of healthy cells thriving in a nutrient-rich agar solution. They multiplied with predictable, steady rhythm. There were no foreign bodies present. There were no parasitic organisms attempting to breach their membranes. The environment was clean, and the biological system functioned exactly as nature intended. I leaned back from the eyepiece and exhaled. My breath sounded even and regular within the heavy filtration hum of the facility. It had been 7 weeks since the heavy wooden doors of the Idaho family court closed behind me. 7 weeks since the gavel struck the sounding block and severed my legal and financial ties to the people who raised me. In the immediate aftermath of a significant judicial intervention, you brace yourself for a residual shockwave. You expect the defeated pathogen to thrash one final time before it expires. The shockwave never reached me. The financial firewall we constructed proved unyielding. The collapse of my parents' constructed reality unfolded with the precise mathematical certainty I had mapped in my contact tracing dossier. The final business day of the month arrived, bringing the catastrophic balloon payments they had desperately tried to evade. Without my federal fellowship to act as a fraudulent bridge loan, the creditors moved swiftly. The multi-level marketing real estate scheme evaporated. The lenders foreclosed on the 3 overpriced vacation cabins in Washington state, seizing the assets to satisfy the delinquent debt. The resulting financial crater swallowed their remaining stability. The commercial bank holding the mortgage on their failing hardware store initiated liquidation proceedings. The business my father had used as a shield for his incompetence was auctioned off in pieces. The inventory was sold for pennies on the dollar, and the building was transferred to a commercial developer. They attempted to contact me twice during the initial freefall. The calls originated from unlisted numbers, bypassing my standard blocks. The voicemails they left were no longer laced with arrogance or demands. They were frantic, hollow pleas. They begged for a conversation, hoping they could leverage old guilt to extract a final rescue operation. I did not return the calls. I forwarded the audio files to Silas Thorne. My attorney reminded them of the standing court order, requiring them to pay my legal fees, and advised them that any further contact would be construed as harassment. The communication ceased. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the tense, expectant silence of a battlefield waiting for the next artillery strike. It was the deep, resonant quiet of a landscape that had finally been cleared of an invasive species. In epidemiology, we study the concept of eradication. When a community eliminates a disease, the focus often lingers on the absence of the illness. But the true scientific marvel of eradication is what happens to the host environment afterward. Without the constant metabolic drain of fighting an infection, the host redirects its energy toward growth. The immune system stops misfiring, cortisol levels stabilize, cellular repair accelerates, the ecosystem heals, and it flourishes in ways that were biologically impossible while it was compromised. I experienced this physiological healing firsthand. For 24 years, my nervous system had operated in a state of perpetual vigilance. I had lived waiting for the next manufactured crisis, the next fabricated medical emergency, the next demand for my resources. My brain was wired to anticipate betrayal. Once the legal quarantine was enforced, that ambient anxiety began to dissipate. I started sleeping through the night without waking to check my phone for urgent text messages. My appetite returned. The persistent tension across my shoulders melted away. I no longer calculated every purchase against the secret ledger of my parents' impending failures. My income belonged to me. My time belonged to me. My energy belonged to me. With my cognitive bandwidth fully restored, I channeled every ounce of my focus into my doctoral research. The federal grant distributed by the corporate trustee functioned exactly as intended. It funded the acquisition of advanced sequencing software and specialized laboratory materials. I spent my days analyzing viral transmission vectors and mapping the genetic mutations of airborne pathogens. Without the draining distractions of familial sabotage, my data models became incredibly precise. My laboratory director, Dr. Eris Thorne, noticed the acceleration in my output. He reviewed my transmission mapping project and recognized its potential impact on public health protocols. He submitted my findings to a prominent peer-reviewed medical journal. The editorial board accepted the paper for expedited publication. The publication caught the attention of the senior directors at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They had already invested in my potential through the fellowship grant, but the published research demonstrated a level of analytical rigor they required for their active containment teams. Yesterday morning, I received an official correspondence from the federal agency. It was not a preliminary award letter. It was a formal offer of employment. They offered me a permanent position as a senior epidemiological analyst, starting immediately upon the completion of my doctoral defense. I would be designing containment strategies for emerging infectious diseases on a national scale. I achieved this milestone entirely on my own merit. I did not need to submit an essay to prove I deserved it. I did not need to sacrifice my savings to earn their approval. I earned the position through relentless focus, disciplined execution, and an uncompromising commitment to the truth. I stripped off my latex gloves and tossed them into the designated biohazard receptacle. I walked over to the stainless steel sink and washed my hands with chemical-grade soap, watching the foam circle the drain. There is a pervasive social narrative that dictates how we are supposed to handle toxic family dynamics. Society tells us that blood is a sacred bond that overrides all logic. We are conditioned to believe that forgiveness is mandatory and that setting a firm boundary is an act of cruelty. Women in particular are trained to be the perpetual caregivers, expected to set themselves on fire to keep their relatives warm. When a daughter walks away from her parents, the world often calls her cold. I am speaking directly to you now. If you are watching this and you are carrying the crushing weight of a family that views you as a resource rather than a human being, you need to hear this truth. Refusing to be consumed does not make you cold. Walking away from a parasitic relationship does not make you malicious. It makes you immune. You cannot cure a disease by inviting it into your bloodstream and hoping your love will change its genetic code. A pathogen operates on instinct. It takes until there is nothing left to take. The only effective treatment is isolation. The only way to survive is to build a wall so high and so strong that the infection starves on the other side. You cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. Healing requires a sterile room. It requires distance. It requires the uncompromising courage to look at the people who created you and decide that your survival is more important than their comfort. I dried my hands with a paper towel. I walked through the laboratory, verifying that every culture was securely stored in the climate-controlled incubation units. I checked the seals on the ventilation hoods. I logged my final data entries into the central server and powered down my workstation. I gathered my belongings and placed my research binder into my canvas bag. I walked out of the laboratory and secured the heavy steel door behind me. I keyed my access code into the security panel, engaging the final lock of the evening. I exited the science building and stepped out into the crisp Idaho night. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine needles from the distant foothills. The sky above Boise was vast and clear, stretching out in an endless expanse of dark blue. I stood on the concrete walkway and took a deep, deliberate breath. My lungs expanded, drawing in the cold, pure air. There were no incoming phone calls demanding my savings. There were no false emergencies waiting to derail my progress. There were no shadows lurking at the edge of my success. I slung my canvas bag over my shoulder and began the walk to my car. My footsteps sounded steady and rhythmic against the pavement. The streetlights cast a bright, unobstructed path ahead of me. I walked forward into the quiet evening, breathing the clean air of total autonomy, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what it felt like to be entirely free.
When the heavy oak doors of the courtroom finally closed and the gavel's echo faded into the crisp Idaho air, Phaedra's journey ceased to be merely a legal battle. It transformed into a mirror, reflecting the most profound and often unspoken shadows hiding within the modern American family. We often look at stories of financial exploitation and courtroom drama as anomalies, dramatic exceptions to the rule of unconditional love. But beneath the surface of the affidavits and the frozen bank accounts lies a much deeper, more universal narrative. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when the traditional values of family and duty are corrupted by the quiet, creeping illusions of the ego. In American culture, there is an immense, unspoken pressure to project the image of the perfect, self-sustaining family. We are driven by the pursuit of success, property, and the polished facade of the American dream. Yet in this relentless pursuit of material security and social standing, it is entirely too easy for parents to lose their connection to the stillness within. When that internal compass is lost, they step blindly into the trap of spiritual blindness, mistaking control for care and ownership for love. We are conditioned to believe that raising children is a sacred duty, but the danger arises when that duty is warped into a transactional ledger. The illusion of the ego tells a parent that a child is an asset, a biological insurance policy designed to secure their old age, or a lifeboat to rescue them from the consequences of their own financial missteps. Phaedra's parents did not wake up one morning and decide to be villains. They simply succumbed to this illusion. They used the sacred concept of family as a psychological weapon, demanding blind loyalty to mask their own failures. But the profound truth, the wisdom that escapes so many, is that children are independent souls. They come into this world through us, but they do not belong to us. They are not extensions of our pride, nor are they the designated carriers of our unhealed wounds. To build a family structure that is genuinely peaceful and nurturing, parents must embark on an inward journey of self-correction. This journey is built upon 3 core pillars: wisdom, morality, and resilience. Wisdom is the foundation of fairness. It requires the profound clarity to see through the fog of greed and material illusion. In a society that constantly tells us we need more property, more status, more wealth, greed can easily blur the lines between what we actually need and what we desperately crave. When parents lack this wisdom, they become willing to sacrifice the very life force of their children to sustain their hollow investments. True wisdom in parenting means understanding the concept of enough. It means recognizing that the greatest act of love is not building a psychological cage around a child to keep them close, but giving them the wings to fly freely, and respecting the boundaries they set when they land. Morality in the context of family goes far beyond following the law. It is rooted in emotional awareness and authentic, unattached love. The highest moral duty of a parent is to nurture with compassion, asking for nothing in return. When parents hide behind the shiny, carefully curated masks of social respectability while plotting to drain their child's resources, they commit a devastating moral violation. Living authentically means having the emotional awareness to strip away that mask. It means sitting at the dinner table and admitting to our children when we have failed, when we are struggling, and when we have lost our way. True familial harmony cannot grow in soil poisoned by deceit. A facade, no matter how beautifully painted, will eventually crack, breeding only resentment and separation. The third pillar, resilience, is the true measure of family responsibility. We often define resilience as the ability to endure hardship. But for a parent, true willpower is the courage to bear the weight of one's own karma. When parents stumble, make poor investments, or let their pride lead them into ruin, genuine responsibility demands that they face the consequences themselves. Attempting to force a child to carry the heavy debts of the previous generation is not a demonstration of traditional family loyalty. It is an act of cowardice. It takes immense inner strength for a parent to let go of their authoritarian control. It requires a profound, quiet bravery to accept that a child has grown into an autonomous adult, capable of independent thought, and fully entitled to build steel boundaries to protect themselves from toxicity. When we view Phaedra's story through this lens, her decision to walk away and legally sever ties takes on a completely different meaning. Society often rushes to label a child who cuts off their parents as cold, ungrateful, or unfilial. But children do not turn their backs on families that offer genuine respect and unconditional love. They only flee environments that systematically drain their will to live. From a deeper perspective, a child establishing a firm boundary is an act of profound, agonizing compassion. It is a ringing bell in the dark. It is the universe offering the parents one final jarring wake-up call, a chance to be jolted out of their ego, to face their own reflection, and to finally begin the hard work of returning to a path of honesty and self-awareness. We all carry pieces of this dynamic within us. Whether we are the children learning to protect our peace, or the parents learning to open our hands and let go. The work of healing a family is always an inside job. If you find yourself reflecting on the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, if you are navigating the delicate, often painful line between familial duty and self-preservation, you are not alone. There is a community of people learning to speak these unspoken truths. We invite you to follow our channel Still Drama Stories, where we continue to explore the profound complexities of family, the necessity of boundaries, and the quiet courage it takes to heal. As the sun sets and the house grows quiet, we are left to ponder the spaces between our own walls. Imagine standing at a living room window, watching the taillights of a car disappear down a darkened street, carrying away someone you once held in your arms. The silence that fills the room behind you is heavy, absolute, and waiting. Is that silence the tragic end of a story you refuse to understand? Or is it the painful, necessary quiet required for you to finally hear your own truth? The answer, as always, is waiting quietly in the dark.